Welcome back, criminophiles, to another episode of Homicide Cases. I'm your host, Misfit. Join me as I explore the criminal mind and American justice.
I'm Johnny Avalos, an American serial killer known as the San Antonio Strangler, who took the lives of 5 people.
Forensic and legal analysis of the Johnny Avalos case, serial homicide, intellectual disability, and the evolution of Eighth Amendment in Texas.
The criminal career of Johnny Avalos, identified by the San Antonio Police Department as the San Antonio Strangler, represents a complex intersection of predatory violence, socioeconomic marginalization, and significant neuropsychological impairment. Between 2012 and 2015, Avalos perpetrated a series of carnal assaults and homicides targeting women in the south and west sides of San Antonio. His victimology, which primarily focused on individuals involved in street-level sex work or those otherwise vulnerable by way of runaway status or substance dependency, underscores a specific predatory pattern often associated with localized serial killers who exploit the vulnerabilities of their own immediate environment. The subsequent legal proceedings, culminating in a guilty plea in 2019 and a series of high-stakes appellate challenges, have made the Avalos case a primary reference point for modern debates regarding the constitutionality of mandatory life sentences for intellectually disabled offenders.
Socio-biographical and developmental profile of Johnny Joe Avalos.
Johnny Avalos was born on December 1, 1986, and spent nearly his entire life within the geographical confines of San Antonio's South Side. His developmental history is marked by early-onset cognitive limitations and a consistent failure to achieve standard educational or social milestones. Forensic evaluations conducted during his capital homicide proceedings revealed that Avalos entered the special education system in the 3rd grade and was never integrated into a regular classroom setting during his primary or secondary schooling. This educational trajectory is indicative of profound developmental delays that were identified but arguably not sufficiently managed by systemic interventions. Prior to the commencement of his known homicide series, Avalos' contact with the criminal justice system reflected a pattern of poor impulse control and low-level volatility. His criminal record included multiple arrests for making terroristic threats, criminal mischief, and the possession of controlled substances. These offenses, while not lethal, demonstrated a predisposition toward antisocial behavior that, when coupled with his significant intellectual deficits, created a high-risk profile for recidivism and escalation. At the time of his arrest for the homicides, Avalos was employed as a dishwasher at a restaurant near the downtown San Antonio district. His employment schedule, finishing shifts late at night, provided him with the cover of darkness and a legitimate reason to be prowling the streets during the early hours of the morning, during which time he would stalk and target his victims. The neuropsychological profile developed during his trial is central to understanding the legal controversy surrounding his sentencing. Experts from both the state and the defense agreed that Avalos meets the critical criteria for intellectual disability. Psychometric testing consistently yielded full-scale intelligence quotient scores in the mid to high 60s, a range classified as extremely low or significantly impaired. Further evaluations suggested that Avalos functions cognitively at the level of a child between the ages of 3 and 8, depending on the specific cognitive domain being measured. This diagnostic constellation suggests an offender who lacked the sophisticated planning typical of organized serial killers, but possessed a recurring, primitive drive for carnal dominance and lethal violence. The presence of schizoaffective disorder and probable autism spectrum disorder, as noted by Dr. John Fabian, further complicates the psychological picture, indicating a persona plagued by both cognitive deficits and disordered thought processes.
Chronology of the homicide series and victimology.
The San Antonio Strangler was active for at least 3 years, though his crimes reached a peak intensity between December 2014 and April 2015. His methodology, which involved manual strangulation and the occasional use of ligatures or plastic bags, remained consistent across his victims.
The initial homicide, Vanessa Lopez, October 2012.
The series began in early October 2012 with the homicide of 25-year-old Vanessa Lopez. Lopez was strangled and her body was disposed of in the San Antonio River within the Mission Reach section. Her body was discovered floating downstream several days after the attack. At the time, the investigation into Lopez's death was hindered by a lack of overt trauma and the environmental degradation of the body in the river. During this period, Bexar County officials were investigating 6 suspicious deaths of women within a 6-month window. Although community rumors of a serial killer were rampant, the San Antonio police chief publicly dismissed these concerns, stating there was no evidentiary link between the cases. The medical examiner ruled Lopez's cause of death as undetermined, a classification that inadvertently allowed Avalos to continue his predatory activities without being identified as a homicide suspect for several years.
The Turning Point, Natalie Chavez, December 2014.
The homicide of 15-year-old Natalie Chavez provided the crucial forensic evidence that would eventually unmask Avalos. Chavez, a runaway who had been out of contact with her family for several months, sent a final text message to her stepfather on December 17, 2014, stating she was ready to return home. On the morning of December 18th, her naked body was discovered under the Vera Cruz Street Bridge over Apache Creek. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation, and the crime scene showed clear signs of a violent struggle. More importantly, forensic investigators recovered DNA evidence from Chavez's body. Although the DNA did not return an immediate match to a suspect in the system, it became the foundation for the eventual identification of the San Antonio Strangler. Avalos later admitted to carnally assaulting and taking the life of Chavez, though he initially claimed he had paid for sex and was unaware of her age.
The 2015 cluster, Perez Ramirez and Celia Lopez.
Following the homicide of Chavez, Avalos's activity accelerated, with 3 additional attacks occurring in early 2015. On approximately January 10, 2015, Avalos took the life of 28-year-old Rosemary Perez. Perez was strangled with his hands and arm, and her body was discovered 2 days later, wrapped in a sheet and abandoned on a sidewalk in the 2100 block of San Fernando. On April 4, 2015, Avalos assaulted 46-year-old Genevieve Ramirez. She was found unconscious and partially nude in a grassy alleyway along the 100 block of Avondale. Ramirez had suffered severe neck trauma. Unlike the other victims, she survived the initial attack but was left in a comatose state. She was hospitalized and later transferred to a nursing facility, where she succumbed to her injuries 2 months later. The final known victim was 29-year-old Celia Lopez. Her body was discovered on April 15, 2015, in the 4400 block of South Presa. She had sustained significant trauma to her head and face in addition to being strangled. The proximity of these locations, all within a narrow geographical band of the south and west sides, points to a predator who utilized familiar territory to minimize the risk of being seen by those who did not know him.
Investigative breakthrough and interrogation.
The resolution of the serial killer investigation was a product of both forensic science and traditional detective work. Detective Leroy Carrion noted the similarities between the Chavez case and subsequent victims and collaborated with the crime lab to prioritize DNA testing. The primary breakthrough occurred in April 2015 when the DNA found on Natalie Chavez was matched to Johnny Avalos. On April 12, 2015, Avalos was arrested and initially charged with carnal assault of a child in connection to the Chavez case. As the investigation deepened, DNA evidence from the Perez, Ramirez, and Celia Lopez crime scenes also matched Avalos. During interrogations with Detective Mark Duke, a trained criminal profiler, Avalos began to reveal the extent of his crimes. Duke noted that Avalos appeared to find pleasure in discussing the homicides, describing them in detail and reliving the events. One of the most chilling aspects of the investigation was Avalos's claim that at least 20 other intended victims had escaped his grasp before he could take their lives. While investigators had been unable to find physical evidence to corroborate the specific number of 20, the claim aligns with his pattern of prowling the streets at night looking for women to attack. This indicates a significantly higher level of predatory activity than the 5 confirmed homicides suggest.
Legal proceedings and the capital punishment withdraw.
The case against Avalos was prepared for trial in the 437th District Court. Initially, the Bexar County District Attorney's Office, then led by Nico LaHood, pursued capital punishment, citing the serial nature of the killings and the extreme cruelty involved. However, the legal landscape regarding the execution of intellectually disabled individuals underwent significant shifts during the pretrial phase. In Atkins v. Virginia, 2002, the United States Supreme Court ruled that executing intellectually disabled persons violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Furthermore, in Moore v. Texas, 2017, the Supreme Court rejected the specific criteria, aka the Briseno factors, that Texas courts have been using to determine intellectual disability, mandating that courts instead rely on modern medical and clinical standards. In response to these rulings and following independent evaluations by both state and defense experts who confirmed Avalos's intellectual disability, prosecutors withdrew their request for capital punishment. On February 19, 2019, Avalos pleaded guilty to capital homicide charges as part of a plea agreement. The agreement resulted in 2 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Avalos would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. During the sentencing hearing, the impact of the crimes was articulated through victim impact statements. Verlinda Guerrero, the mother of Vanessa Lopez, stated she had prayed for a life sentence rather than capital punishment, while Carlos Johnson, Natalie Chavez's stepfather, expressed that the sentence brought no sense of satisfaction because the loss of his stepdaughter remained permanent.
Constitutional challenges and the Eighth Amendment appeal.
Despite the guilty plea and the life sentence, the Avalos case entered a protracted appellate phase that centered on the individualized sentencing doctrine. Avalos's legal team argued that even a sentence of life without parole could be considered unconstitutionally cruel and unusual if it was mandated automatically by statute without a hearing to consider mitigating evidence, such as the defendant's intellectual disability.
The Miller v. Alabama precedent.
The core of the appeal was based on Miller v. Alabama 2012, which held that mandatory life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders are unconstitutional. Avalos's attorneys considered that because intellectually disabled adults share many of the same characteristics as juveniles, including diminished capacity to process information, poor impulse control, and an inability to understand the full consequences of their actions. The Miller protections should be extended to them.
Appellate court rulings.
The path of the appeal through the Texas court system was marked by significant reversals. 1. Fourth Court of Appeals, June 2020. A panel initially affirmed the trial court's sentence, ruling that existing Supreme Court precedents did not require individualized sentencing for intellectually disabled adults. 2. En banc reconsideration, December 30th, 2020. The full Fourth Court of Appeals reversed the panel's decision. They ruled that Section 12.31 subsection, a 2 of the Texas Penal Code was unconstitutional as applied to Avalos because it automatically imposed the harshest possible penalty allowed for his class without an opportunity to present mitigating evidence. 3. Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. 2021, the state's highest criminal court reversed the en banc decision. The TCCA held that the Supreme Court's holding in Miller v. Alabama was specific to the transient nature of youth and the potential for rehabilitation, which does not apply to the permanent condition of intellectual disability. They reinstated the mandatory life without parole sentences. 4. U.S. Supreme Court petition. May 2022, Avalos filed a petition for a writ of certiorari number 21-7929, asking the Supreme Court to resolve whether the Eighth Amendment requires individualized sentencing for the intellectually disabled.
Social and community impact. Genevieve's purses and reform.
The legacy of the Johnny Avalos case extends beyond the courtroom, having galvanized community-led efforts to support vulnerable populations in San Antonio. One of the most significant initiatives is Genevieve's Purses, a ministry founded by Dana Mechia Marquez. Marquez, who had attempted to help Genevieve Ramirez leave the streets before her homicide, created the program to provide sex workers with purses containing hygiene products and a card-sharing Genevieve story. The initiative aims to offer a sense of dignity and a link to resources for those who are at the highest risk of being targeted by predators. Furthermore, the case highlighted the critical role of programs like the Esperanza Court, a specialty drug court that focuses on providing therapy and rehabilitation for individuals with multiple prostitution convictions and substance abuse issues. By addressing the underlying issues of trauma and addiction, these programs seek to prevent future tragedies by removing individuals from the high-risk environments where Avalos prowled.
Forensic criminological analysis of the Southside serial killer.
From a forensic perspective, Avalos fits the profile of a spatially constrained serial killer. His activities were centered in a specific socio-economic ecosystem where he felt comfortable and where his presence was less likely to draw suspicion. His employment as a dishwasher near downtown provided him with a legitimate anchor point for his nocturnal activity. His choice of victimology women who were often isolated by addiction or runaway status is a common trait among serial killers who seek less dead victims whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or vigorously investigated. The initial undetermined ruling in the Vanessa Lopez case is a testament to how serial killers can be obscured when the victims belong to marginalized groups. The intellectual disability of Avalos also provides a unique data point in serial killer research. While many serial predators possess high degrees of manipulative intelligence, referred to as psychopathy, Avalos's crimes were driven by primitive impulses and a lack of cognitive inhibition. His inability to comprehend the severity of his actions or the inevitability of his capture, evidenced by his blank stare during victim impact statements, underscores the profound neuropsychological impairment that defined his life and his crimes. As of 2026, Johnny Joe Avalos remains incarcerated at the Preston E. Smith Unit, a maximum security prison in La Mesa, Texas. The legal arguments raised in his case regarding the Eighth Amendment continue to influence capital litigation and sentencing reform for intellectually disabled offenders across the United States. The San Antonio Strangler case remains a sobering study in the intersection of systemic neglect, predatory violence, and the enduring quest for justice within the American criminal justice system.
Well, what do you think? Do the courts need to adopt individualized sentencing for offenders with intellectual disabilities? I've got a lifetime in here to think about it.
That ends another episode of Homicide Cases as I close the file on Johnny Avalos. Join me next time when I'll be opening the file on Jorge Avila Torres.
Thank you for watching. If this is your kind of content, then please give me a like and follow. It'll help keep this series going. This is Misfit signing off, and as always, stay safe.